just want to talk a bit about us. This is where you can find us at sciencegateways.org. We have basically three areas of services that we offer. One of them is support for building and running gateways. That includes hands-on development support, where someone will work up to quarter time on your gateway for a matter of months up to a year. We also have consultants who can offer specialized advice, as well as a catalog that can help you find software and examples of gateways that you can use. Then we offer extensive education and training that includes this webinar series, but also our Gateway Focus Week, which used to be called Boot Camp. It is an intensive week for people developing their gateway, and you can learn and think all about who you're trying to make this available to, why, and how to keep it funded and sustainable. Our student-focused programs include all sorts of terrific things, including internships, a summer coding institute, participation at conferences, and a hackathon. Our annual conference, which I mentioned already, is coming up, and we have a lot of website resources that you can use as well. And finally, networking community, which is what our talk is about today. We have a partner program that can put you in touch with people who have complementary services and opportunities. Our affiliates program is for people who would like to promote software that they have and support it for gateway developers who'd like to use it. And our blog and news and job postings are ways of spreading the word to those of you in our community. And I will also mention that our community forum is an opportunity to join. It's a Google group that will let you be able to post. You can post questions to the group, and people do respond and help out with that. So those are our three main areas of services, and they all work together to bring you the array of great stuff that the Science Gateways Community Institute can support you with. So do check out all of that at sciencegateways.org. And then finally, I just want to put in a brief plea to ask you if you could give us feedback at the end of this webinar. This is free, and we're funded by the National Science Foundation to provide it, and it's wonderful to be able to let them know that it has been valuable to you. We also have a question in our feedback that lets you put in suggestions for other topics, and we really do look at that and use it to figure out our future programming. So I will be putting this link in the chat area during our presentation. And a reminder again, do put your questions in chat, and we'll save them for the end of Sara Jane's presentation. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and let Sara Jane take over with that. And I'm really pleased to introduce Sara J Morris, who I discovered while wandering around on the internet looking for people who were experts about building technology communities. She currently has her own business offering consulting about community engagement and building community, but she has a terrific resume of experience in building community. And you'll see as she presents, she'll tell you a little bit more about that. So now I will hand it off to Sara J Morris.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
And can you see the slide here, the main Community Building 101? Okay, perfect. So I will get started. Great. So again, thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here today. So today I'm going to spend some time with you to talk about the value of building a community around your gateway. I'm going to dive into my definition and approach to inclusive community building, and I'll talk about the benefits of community collaboration. Together, we'll cover some key questions that you can ask yourself along the way. Then we'll take some time to recap, and as Catherine mentioned, I'm going to be available at the end of my talk to answer any questions that come up. So before I jump in, I just want to give everyone a quick disclaimer. This is my cat, Joni. I work from home, and so does Joni, and sometimes she has something to say. So if you hear any sort of like rustling or meowing in the background, that's her. All right, so I've introduced my cat. Allow me to introduce myself. As Catherine mentioned, I'm Sara J Morris. Most folks call me SJ, so feel free to do that. I've been building communities for tech companies of all sizes since 2004, and I've been exclusively focused on building out developer communities since 2011. I've built developer communities communities for companies like API management company Imagery. And Imagery was actually acquired by Intel while I was there, so I got to be a part of the mega corporation that is Intel for a little while. I worked with a small startup at a company called Keen.io with a great team, and most recently, prior to launching my consultancy, I led Shopify's developer community effort. For those of you who are aware, Shopify is one of the biggest e-commerce platforms out there. So earlier this year, I just decided to take the leap and become my own boss. And I was really driven by my desire to see the developer communities that I work with not only grow, but also become welcoming, diverse, inclusive, and ultimately more active and sustainable. And so, what are we talking about when we say community? You know, it's a common word, we use it often. But there's a way that I interpret it in the work that I do, and I'll talk a little bit about how we can approach it for science gateways. So a community is a group with a shared principle, interest, cause, or place navigating that commonality together. In other words, one community member's actions can impact the community as a whole. So many of my fellow community specialists in the tech industry will actually have a bit more of a positive definition around community. But I think it's really important to recognize that a community is a living and breathing thing that takes work to manage and foster. One member of the community has the potential for both positive and negative impact. And really the work that I do is to mitigate that impact to make the community as healthy as possible for all of its members. So now when it comes to science gateways, I've adapted my tech community approach a little bit to make it more applicable. So a gateway community can be built around research, education, projects, and ideas. Gateway communities can be leveraged to encourage research awareness, share and exchange knowledge, push innovation forward, and really gather valuable feedback. Okay, so now that we're all aligned on community and how it can benefit your gateway, I do want to make sure that we're aligned in a few of the other key definitions of words that I'm going to be using frequently throughout this talk. So I'm not sure about the science world, but certainly in tech, there has been a super important conversation happening around inclusion. Unfortunately, it seems that this conversation has almost become overly buzzwordy and really lacking true depth. Some tech companies discuss inclusion when they're trying to attract talent and recruit folks and build a culture, which is really important, but they're not necessarily always doing the work that's needed to maintain inclusive cultures, which sometimes is quite work intensive. So the dialogue around inclusion, it's been largely focused on recruitment and HR, but it hasn't really been part of the conversation when it comes to building community in tech, and that's something that I'm really hoping to change. So ultimately, the concept of inclusion itself is pretty simple when it comes to community building. Inclusive communities don't just invite diverse folks to join in, they welcome them with open arms. The hard part is that the work that it takes to make it happen, as I mentioned. And so we're going to be covering that quite a bit in the 10 questions that we'll look at today. And finally, the other word that you're going to hear me say a lot today is diversity. Diversity and diverse communities are truly necessary for innovation. So the unique constellation of what makes us all different as humans is really what comes together to make a community richer and stronger. So this is a wheel of the wheel of diversity, which is a visual that really helps to highlight all of the different dimensions of lived experiences that we have as individuals. Embracing our individual and collective dimensions of experience and what they bring to communities is really what this is all about. Okay, great. So we've covered the definitions. Now let's get into what we're going to actually cover in today's talk. We're going to walk through 10 key questions to ask yourself when looking to build an inclusive and sustainable gateway community. So first we'll look a little bit at who your community members are. We'll look at seeking out diverse feedback to grow your gateway. We'll look at some ways to do that, some ways to make your space inclusive by using welcoming language and imagery. We'll talk about codes of conduct, what they are and how they can benefit your gateway. We'll look at feedback channels to really drive home that inclusion with your gateway. We'll talk about the benefits of collaboration within your gateway community. And then we'll get a little bit more into that by looking at, when should you join in and lead conversations that are happening in your gateway community, and when should you sort of step back. We'll look at potentially collaborating with external gateway communities to kind of scale your message. And finally, we'll look at encouraging community and collaboration in brand new gateways or gateways that are a little bit less active and could use some energy boost. In here? All right, cool. So first of all, who are the different community audiences that you want to be keeping in mind? So there's your gateway community users. So these are folks coming to your gateway to learn more, participate, and potentially contribute. And then there are the community owners, which is, I suspect, most of you on the call today. And these are the folks that are actually doing the work of building the gateway community, both from a technical and content perspective, and often both. So knowing your community members is key. Are they looking to contribute to your research? Are they looking to follow along, ask questions, be more passive or active, all of the above? I know there was a analytics webinar for last month's SGCI webinar, and you should watch that to help you kind of guide you in the direction of highlighting, based on traffic patterns, what visitors want out of your gateway community, but actually directly asking them can go a really long way. That can be done in your discussion forums, that can be done via short surveys, or that can be done during account creation, wherever it's applicable to you. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those options in a moment. Okay, so next, when it comes to building out your gateway your gateway community, seeking many different perspectives for input is really key. So I have a great example of a missed community feedback opportunity in tech that was shared by user experience researcher and project manager Nancy Douillon, who was working for Google when I attended the Tech Inclusion in San Francisco conference in 2016 and went to her talk. So her talk was all about inclusive product design, and she showcased a glaring example of unconscious bias oversight and a lack of diverse feedback for the Oculus VR headset. Essentially, the first version of the Oculus VR headset was unwearable by folks with thick hairstyles, braids, anything that goes on the head, turbans, basically any other modalities outside of that of the largely young male beta community testing it. And so while this is a hardware example, it does showcase how easily glaring feedback omissions can impact your user experience on your gateway. So make sure that you're seeking and gathering gateway feedback from as diverse an audience as possible to really make your gateway the best it can be. So I'll move on to looking at content. Certain language choices in your gateway may unknowingly alienate members of your community. So how do you mitigate this? Luckily, technology has been developed to help us identify unconscious bias in language. There exists an enterprise tool called Textio, which analyzes language to actually point out those bias and make suggestions for alternatives. Unfortunately, that tool recently became prohibitively expensive, something along the lines of $30,000 a year. So it's not something I have access to, or some of my larger clients might, but luckily, some developers actually taken the spirit and technology behind Textio and built out some free tools. One such example is something called the Gender Decoder. It's a simple tool that was originally designed for job ads that basically allows you to input text, and it outputs some subtly gender-coded word choices that could be improved. I'll give a couple examples. Some are, the words bossy and feisty. These research has shown that these words are rarely used to describe men, but tend to be alienating towards women. And on the flip side, sort of, the words welcoming and inclusive skew towards feminine, but also positive based on the data. So what the gender decoder does, it just points you in the direction of identifying words in your content that you may want to consider replacing. So in the case of bossy or feisty, you may want to tweak that. But chances are you actually wouldn't want to tweak the words welcoming or inclusive, or at least I hope not, because I'm saying them a lot in this talk, just because they skew feminine. Ultimately, Gender Decoder is a great guiding tool, but doesn't need to be followed to the letter. In any case, you can find the link to the Gender Decoder, as well as all of the other inclusion tools that I'm going to reference in the next few slides at listentous/inclusion. So that's lsn2.us/inclusion. And that's going to be something you might want to bookmark, because there's going to be a lot of resources on there that I'm constantly adding. All right. And so when we're talking about content, we're going to move into imagery now. So as much as you need to ensure that your written content is inclusive, the visual cues that your content and community conveys are equally important to get right. Choosing an inclusive imagery may not be as simple as running content through a tool. The visual choices you make need to actually be representative of your community. So for example, there are many fantastic image sets featuring folks of color in a tech or academic setting available for your use. But if you use them on a job listing, for example, and you don't actually have any members of the underrepresented communities of folks of color that are part of your project, then you're setting up a potential applicant up for disappointment and frankly a certain level of deception. However, if you're considering images to go alongside more generic content, such as research updates, open source project page, seminar invite, or a knowledge sharing article, these images can actually send a signal that the representation of all dimensions of humanity is really important to your gateway community. So some of the image collections that are available out there, there are lots, but the ones that I like a lot include the Women of Color in Tech Flickr set. In fact, that's one of the images on this slide. Those images are available for broad use across the board as long as you attribute them. And Broadly has something called the Gender Spectrum Collection that normalizes images of non-binary folks in day-to-day situations. So, at the office, drinking coffee, just basically normalizing the experience of a wide variety of humans. It should be noted that the Gender Spectrum Collection images can't be used for commercial purposes, so it's important to read through the specific guidelines that are available on the link to the inclusion resources. And again, listen to us/inclusion is where you can find these photo sets and the guidelines that I mentioned. So moving on. Now we've talked a little bit about how to approach content and images from an inclusivity perspective, but let's talk a little bit about the actual tools that you're using to manage your community. So a lot of my clients' early stage communities live in different chat tools and collaboration tools out there, like Slack or Discord, if you're familiar with those. So both of those are actually really great tools that take mere seconds to set up and provide an immediate way to interact with your community. But they do have significant drawbacks as your gateway community starts to scale and grow. So as conversations stream through Slack and Discord's more chat-driven communities, there are valuable nuggets of knowledge that can kind of vanish into thin air and be hard to retrieve for both you and your gateway community members. As your community grows, it won't be sustainable anymore to be able to provide immediate questions to questions as they come in. You're just going to be overloaded with questions. So also, net new members, folks considering joining your community and your gateway, they may have questions or feedback to provide, but they may not yet be committed enough to your gateway to actually want to join another Slack or become a member of a new chat group. These chat tools actually are a great exclusive offer for your more active and committed community members that you have a strong relationship with and are willing to provide that one-to-one support to. But really, your public community should be a forum for the following reasons. One is SEO, and so that stands for search engine optimization. Basically, the results that come up on Google when folks are looking up specific keywords or phrases and making sure that yours come up closest to the top. And I believe there's been a webinar in the SGCI series about SEO, so check that one out. So basically, the forums do get readily indexed by search engines. So that means answers to any sort of long tail, hyper-specific questions will come up in search results and direct people to your forum. And that will also help folks have answers to their questions before you even have to directly address them yourself. So that takes the onus off you a little bit. And you'll also be able to track traffic, again, back to the analytics reference. You'll be able to track traffic to these specific posts, which can be really a strong indicator as to what answers folks are looking for and what ways you can potentially improve your community to address what folks are seeking. And also, most forum tools, there are great forum tools out there called Discourse. There's another one called Vanilla. There's a whole lot out there, another one called Lithium. Most of these forum tools come with a baked-in knowledge base. So basically, a knowledge base is a feature that allows you to take the most commonly asked questions in your forums and other places and create an easily accessible kind of guide and searchable database of frequently asked questions. And that will free up the actual forum itself for more collaborative discussions, for feedback, and for more community building focused things and less support. All right. So forums are really important. And if there is one community investment that you're going to make in the very early stages of your gateway growth, it's a code of conduct. And a code of conduct essentially is a set of specific guidelines that ensure that all members of your community are feeling welcome, safe, and included, and have a course of action to follow if that's ever not the case. So even if you only have an online user community or a forum, a short code of conduct is a way to ensure that gateway participants of all walks of life feel protected and welcome in your community. So this is especially true once you start growing your community in new ways, like hosting seminars or open source code components of your project, or even if you're doing anything, offline, perhaps through hackathons and things like that. Indeed, academic spaces, I'm sure, I'm not a big part of them, but I'm assuming they maintain a certain level of professional decorum that's a little higher than perhaps your typical online community. But even with that being the case, a code of conduct serves as a really strong signal of care for your community. And again, it doesn't really need to be long at all. A great place to get started to find the right code of conduct that's going to work well for your gateway can be found through a resource called the Geek Feminism Wiki, which is a loaded name for sure, but it actually has a ton of great resources, not just about feminism, but about all things inclusion related. So just as important as code of conduct creation is code of conduct enforcement. So getting your team trained up on how to respond to any code of conduct violations, knock on wood, hopefully they don't happen, but if they do, you need to be ready. And really, it's the only way to ensure that having a code of conduct provide meaningful value to your community. Again, on Listen to Us/inclusion, I've included a link to Valerie Aurora and Mary Gardner's enforcement guide. And just as a note, Valerie Aurora was one of the founders of Geek Feminism Wiki and also a trailblazer in the Linux open source community. So she has a tremendous amount of knowledge and awareness on managing communities, and especially in tech and open source, which I feel like the open source world does intersect with a lot of the work that's happening through gateways. All right. So we want to understand a little bit more about who's actually being exposed to your gateway, who's learning more about it, how are you getting the word out? So in order to get into the minds of your current and potential community members, it's important to kind of step outside yourself a little bit and the network that you know and trust. So that network, if you're lucky, your network will always be there to support and inform your research. But to better understand the potential of a community of gateway users, you really need to understand how they're interpreting your gateway with fresh eyes. So there's a number of ways to go about this. Ultimately, they all involve one key thing, which is listening. Then that's no small reason as to why I called my community consultancy Listen. So depending on the size of your current community, you can approach this in a number of ways. You can do user interviews. They can be really insightful. Even while you're still sort of like generating your own feedback as you conduct your own research, it's important to sort of seek the perspectives of others around that research. Also, you can consider a survey. Not only will this give you a clear line of sight into the benefits and drawbacks of your current gateway user experience, but it can also give you an opportunity, if you choose, to measure a real baseline of the dimensions of diversity within your current gateway community, which will allow you to set realistic goals around diversity and inclusion as you grow. Okay, so we've covered some core ideas around building an inclusive gateway community. I want to shift the focus a bit now and talk a little bit more about community collaboration opportunities. And since we're halfway through, I started throwing in some interesting gifts to keep you engaged and interested. Cool. So Before I jump into that, I want to take a quick moment to thank some of the folks that I'll be referencing in a few of today's examples. These folks are all community experts that I deeply respect in the tech industry. The great news is their experiences building communities can easily be mapped to your gateway community building strategies. And, I've listed all their Twitter handles here under their names, so you can follow them all on Twitter if that's your thing. So Neil Mansilla is the head of developer experience at Atlassian. And for folks who use tools like Jira, Trello, things like that, Atlassian is the parent company. Taylor Barnett is the lead community engineer at a smaller startup that I'm assuming most of the folks in this call may not have heard of. It's called Stoplight, and their focus is API design and API management. And I included them so we could get perspectives of smaller community building. Elizabeth Kinsey leads developer marketing at Slack, which I've referenced a few times. It's a chat and collaboration tool that's very popular in tech, and I know some of the folks on the call are likely Slack users. And finally, Liz Kuto is my former colleague over at Shopify, and she leads product marketing management for all of the developer products. So these experts, again, they each represent various community sizes, and I'm hopeful there's going to be an actionable example for everyone listening today. Okay, so the word collaboration, something we use a lot, but it can be a little vague. So I want to wrap our heads around this word in the context of today's webinar before we dive in. Collaboration in communities generally refers to folks coming together in some way to do a thing. That's vague, but typically this thing will hopefully have a positive outcome. So what can that look like in the context of gateway communities? Some of the types of collaboration that came up in my expert interviews and also in my personal experience building communities include seeing community members help troubleshoot each other's issues, coming to solutions together and answering each other's questions in community forums, literally seeing community members jumping in and fixing each other's code, community members actually reaching out to external gateways to join forces or external communities to join forces. And finally, I think my favorite part is when community members provide each other with inspiration, mentorship, and just general overall support in their journeys. Okay, so I want to get into some examples. So Neil Mansilla, who's again Atlassian's head of developer experience, shared a story with me about some spontaneous community collaboration that happened during a recent Atlassian App Week. An App Week is basically a yearly community event for Atlassian's top community developers. It sounds a lot like the Gateway events that's coming up in September for all you Gateway owners. So without prompting, a group of these Atlassian community developers came together at App Week and started doing integration tests with each other's apps. So that basically means like, what is it like to have multiple Atlassian apps working together? So they already knew well that their individual apps were working fine on their own, but what they didn't know without being kind of coming together as a collective is that there were problems that were emerging when Atlassian customers started to use multiple of these apps at the same time. So what these community developers did was they took it upon themselves to not only test multiple app integrations and solve for any of the issues that came up, but they started to release their testing frameworks to the rest of the broader developer community to leverage. And really, this was all in the name of a faster and healthier platform ecosystem for Atlassian. So a great way of demonstrating how community can accelerate innovation and problem solving for a product or for research or for your gateway. And okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about how engaged community can help decrease any incoming questions and support problems. So a sure sign that your community members are collaborating with each other and supporting each other is when they take it upon themselves to actually create their own dedicated spaces to work through their own discussions and help each other solve problems. Another Atlassian example, and in this case, it's one of their community developers created their own Slack instance as a place to hash out relevant topics away from the watchful eye of Atlassian. In fact, to this day, this community Slack does not have any actual Atlassian employee members, and it's truly only community developers within this Slack that are supporting each other. So this external community allows Atlassian community developers to work through their problems together, with no expectation of Atlassian's involvement, which takes a significant load off of Atlassian's support team. All right, so I'm going to get into a sort of smaller community startup example. Stoplight, as I mentioned, is a blossoming developer community. Taylor, my friend from Stoplight, actually told me a story about a member of their developer community that built out an open source plugin that the rest of the community could leverage. It was really meeting a pain point that many of the developers within the community were able to apply right away. So the interesting thing is that this developer in question actually holds a day job at a really large enterprise company. So the fact that this developer was interested in giving back to an early stage growing community really symbolized a deep commitment to Stoplight and its future. And, knowing Taylor, she's truly an expert at, building out supportive communities. So the takeaway here is that the more you create a supportive environment for your community members, the more likely that they are to want to give back to it. So if your community fosters, showcases, and supports problem solving, members will definitely feel more inclined to collaborate with each other and share their own solutions with the broader community. Okay, cool. So I think this is possibly my last example. I don't 100% remember, but I spoke to my former colleague Liz from Shopify, and she shared a really lovely example of how the Shopify developer community can come together. And so she told me about a community developer that spends most of their time building custom stores for folks who want to launch a custom store on Shopify. So that involves being fairly technical and getting into the code. This developer also loves building out Shopify apps, and basically those are add-ons to add additional functionality to Shopify stores that any of a Shopify merchants can leverage through the App Store. In any case, this developer had not had the chance to build apps for a long time because their business was really focused on building these custom stores, but they did miss building these apps. So they figured they would look to the community to see if there was any newer app developers that were getting started, so they could provide some mentorship to them. And the great news is he took it upon himself to identify some university graduates that were active in Shopify's developer Facebook community. They were just getting started, and he chose to mentor them and really, really, truly help scale their business. They're now one of Shopify's top app developers. So this is a real example of community sustainability. The more experienced community member comes in to help accelerate the growth of a newer community member in what will hopefully become a virtuous cycle. Hopefully now that these university developers have scaled their business, that they can pay it forward and do that for a new group of developers starting out. All right. Now we have a better grip on what collaboration can actually look like and how it can benefit your community. So I want to jump into when you should take the lead on community conversations versus letting them happen more organically. So no community can rely on its members to constantly collaborate and support each other. There's really a time and place to let conversations and interactions run their course, and there's a time for you as a gateway leader to jump in and help out. Everybody will have a little bit of a different approach to that depending on their gateway or community, but there are definitely some best practices to share. I think the most important thing that I want to stress when it comes to setting expectations around when you should be communicating with your community versus when the community should collaborate amongst themselves is establishing your communication channels. So where are your gateway users going to hear the latest announcements? Where can they discover new research? Where can they discover project updates, opportunities to collaborate or add data? And where can they learn about the latest seminars? So it's essential to make this information easy to access and consistent. Try not to move these specific resources around your gateway website too often, so folks get used to where to look to find information. And also when it comes to email, if that's relevant to the gateway community, if there's any newsletters or update emails that you're sending out semi-regularly, be it monthly or weekly, it's important to have consistent subject lines so folks can easily find these updates in their definitely full inboxes, something we all suffer from. And creating this consistency will really minimize ambiguity within your community. It will give members more space and time to actually collaborate and push your community forward through innovation, because they're spending less time trying to find answers to really basic questions. All right, so the touch points that we've mentioned thus far, online communities, forums, chat tools, they're really par for the course when it comes to community outlets. However, in my interviews, Shopify and Slack both mentioned the importance of email again, specifically mentioning their newsletters in interacting with their communities. So newsletters may seem sort of like a one-to-many kind of blast with more of a one-to-one reply model. But they can inspire community conversation and collaboration in the forums. And then another thing I wanted to call out, again, another story from Taylor from Stoplight. She talked about transitioning her community from their support tool over to the forum so more community members could benefit from the questions that were coming in. So Stoplight was using a tool called Intercom, and for those who don't know, Intercom is an on-site messaging support tool. So it's basically a chat widget that lives directly on your site that provides fairly quick one-to-one support. It's a really awesome tool, but it's not a community tool. It's really a one-to-one tool. So what she was trying to do is move folks from Intercom when they'd ask an important question and ask them to post it in the forum so others can benefit from seeing the questions and answers. The other cool thing about Intercom is that the way that you can access data through their tool really helps Taylor identify the kinds of questions that developers were looking for answers to. So she was able to kind of create and inform her forum structure and different categories based on this incoming Intercom data. All right, so we're getting closer to the end now, but I just want to spend some time talking about diving deeper into best practices and tips around approaching external gateway communities that might be relevant to your gateway's collaboration and growth. So in order to identify what these gateways are, chances are if you're doing something fairly niche, you have a good sense of who your fellow research network is. But in the off chance that you're looking for new opportunities, there are some suggestions. So starting by setting up some simple alerts. Google Alerts is a great tool that will kind of scour the web on a daily or weekly basis, up to you, based on certain keywords. So using your area of research, your gateway name, whatever it may be, Google Alerts will identify any external community chatter that's happening, which can give you a moment to sort of judge and decide if you want to reach out to grow your community by taking a look at this chatter. Now, there's other ways you can do that. You can either have Google Alerts emailed to you, or you can use a tool called Zapier, and Zapier is awesome. Basically, Zapier facilitates all kinds of API to API connections, and an API, without getting too much into it, but an API is an application programming interface. Basically, it's a set of data that you can connect with other sets of data to do cool things. You can use Zapier to create something like a Slack alert. So if you use Slack with your gateway and your gateway community, you could potentially create a Slack channel that is populated with Google alerts around your project as they come in. So that's another alternative for those who don't want to add more stuff to their inbox. So just one thing I want to call out. If you're seeing some great conversations come up in these external communities, I would suggest proceeding with a level of caution when you're deciding whether to jump in then and there, especially if there's like support type questions that would be better served by pointing the person to your gateway. One important point is that participation starts to create an expectation. And if you've dabbled in responses in an external community, but then you suddenly drop off, you may impact potential collaborator trust. So folks that are considering joining your community and see that you've dropped off and you aren't following up with any further support on this particular community, it might impact your overall trust. And it's important to just send folks to your gateway, stick with those consistent community information channels. All right, so Continuing on that theme a little bit, I think I've reiterated enough times now about how crucial it is to be consistent with those official communication channels. And if your gateway members start to feel like they aren't getting the help that they need from within your community, certainly this is true in developer communities, that you may start to hear from them outside the community, whether it be on social media or elsewhere. And this can give folks who are thinking of becoming a part of your community pause before they join. And it can also impact your existing community members if they see that there's frustration going on. It just sort of indicates a reduction in the level of trust, which can be a hard challenge to tackle. So try to keep folks pointed to your gateway at all times. Okay, so we've covered some of the approaches to handling communication and collaboration in more active gateway communities. I'll try to zap through this so we have enough time for questions. What are some of the best practices to spark community and collaboration in newer or less active science gateways? So spending time talking to any remotely engaged community gateway members at an early stage is crucial. Really sets the stage for that all-important trust building that makes or breaks a community. And so the experts that I spoke to, they spoke to their early stage users often, and to this day, they continue to speak to them. And those folks have become some absolute leaders in the community and have really sort of set the stage for the tone of the rest of the community as a result of this early stage relationship strengthening. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about asking your users specific questions. This can really help to inform how you're going to build out your gateway, whether it be through one-to-one conversations, doing surveys. Building that trust is really important. And just a call out that it's really important to ensure that you're speaking to as diverse a subset of users as you can in order to gather the kind of feedback that you really need to grow a safe and inclusive community with staying power. Getting close to the end here. So I'm going to quickly recap some of these collaboration takeaways. First, some of the benefits of gateway community collaboration include healthier gateway communities that lead to users coming together to really make things better, as in Atlassian's app testing example. And increased gateway resources and contributions, a lot like the Stoplight open source plugin example, showcases how important community can be to supporting all of the users. And user inspiration and mentorship is something that we saw in Shopify as example. Setting the stage for this collaboration means being consistent with your gateway community channels, making sure that you monitor less obvious community channels like email, and set up those basic Google alerts to help you identify chatter and save you time. And again, be careful when participating in external communities whenever possible. Guide potential community members back to the gateway where they can get the latest information, and you won't be setting up an expectation of external support. And finally, in new gateway communities, talk to early stage users early and often and build relationships with them. Ask them direct questions and do what you can to really address those answers, whether in building out your community or just letting them know that you're listening. And I have one more final tip. I know that the SGCI community seems like there's all kinds of fantastic initiatives going on to help support each other. So make sure that you take advantage of this great community that brought you, this webinar and all kinds of other resources. Some of my favorite communities as a community professional are kind of these meta community Slacks where it's me and a bunch of other community professionals talking about community in a community. And some similar conferences, but without those conferences, I feel like I wouldn't be growing professionally, and they really make me a better professional every day. So take advantage of all of these resources. And so that's it. I know I threw a lot at you. Thank you so much. I'm not going to read my little blurb or ad for my consultancy, but you can reach out to me on Twitter or email. The address is listed. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah Jane. We are now open for questions, and we have plenty of time for them. So I'll wait a moment and see if any pop up. You're welcome to put them into the chat, and I'll read them to Sarah Jane. And while we're waiting, I'm going to ask you a question, Sarah Jane, because this is a lot of different things we could think about. I'm wondering if there was one really important thing that you would want someone to do in terms of taking an action of all these different things. Where should they start?
So I'm going to make some assumptions based on your question. This is someone starting out a brand new gateway, wanting to take the first steps to build out a community. Is that correct?
Yeah, or just, I mean, these might be existing gateways that just have never
Okay.
bothered, tried to have a community. And I mean, because I think my sense is listening to, the beginning part, which is about, being making sure it feels inclusive and so forth. Some of those concerns may be more or less useful for some folks. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So just, if they were, I think so when it's a really large and public community, it might be more of a concern about that kind of, broad representation and so
Yeah.
forth. So yeah, so then if they're taking into account that they've got like this community of, several hundred or several thousand people who might be potential gateway users,
Mhm.
where should they first think about making it seem the most attractive to be part of that community?
Yeah, I think that I strongly believe in the power of signaling that a code of conduct can provide. Um, Not everyone agrees with me as that being the be all and end all of importance for a first step, but I think it's something that needs to be in place from the get go so that um, basically anyone and everyone feels like this is going to be a welcoming and inclusive place to be. So that
Hmm.
would be my first step. But in terms of actually getting the community starting to interact with each other. There's a lot of sort of tricks that you can deploy. You can start seeding questions. You can develop those relationships with those really strong community members and actually ask them to go in and seed some conversations and just be like, oh, hey, I noticed that you're working on this really cool thing with this data set. Would you like to share this with the community? So sometimes there's a lot of sort of intentional seeding that needs to happen before the sort of organic activity kicks in. So identifying those opportunities for conversation and collaboration and kind of like pushing them a little bit more at the beginning than you would once the sort of machine is in motion.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Um, there has been a question that's come in from Mike. He says, how do you initiate the formation of a community from a large group of users of a gateway that may not know they should be a community?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oftentimes, that's sort of the running sort of question within community professionals. Like, do we consider a community folks that just because they have a shared sort of purpose, if they don't know about each other, are they actually a community? So I think that so this is, pardon my lack of full awareness of what sort of data points you have access to in your gateways. But in launching a community, one of the first things you can do is just, if you don't have a forum yet, you just simply have all of these users, sending out an email to all of them and just sort of asking them what they need, what they're looking for, what more resources can you provide them, what more support can you provide them, and just hearing back what people say. Maybe somebody will reply with, I'm working on this particular initiative with this data set, and then somebody else will reply and saying, I have this data set, and then you can connect the two of them. And if they start building a collaboration together, then it makes sense to talk to them as some of the first folks to bring on to potentially a new forum, or potentially you start with a smaller chat group to the very, very beginning, and once you start to scale, then you launch a forum. So there's a lot of different ways of approaching it, but really I think that the basic guidance I would provide without knowing the absolute details would be to start a conversation with folks wherever you can and connect people to start getting that sense of shared purpose seeded throughout your community.
Great. Thanks. Uh, there is not another question yet here. So I'm going to take just a brief moment. I'm going to share my screen
Yeah.
and let other people, so we can just do a quick pitch for upcoming webinar topics. Just a moment here. Doop. So hopefully folks can see that, and we will also keep an eye out for additional questions from the audience. But I just want to encourage you also, everyone, to know that in our next webinar, which is September 11th, We'll be talking about containers and Abaco. I know we just also talked about containers in another couple contexts, but so this is container quarter, I guess you could say. But Joe Stubbs from Texas Advanced Computing Center will be talking about Abaco and containers. And also, just want to remind you about Gateways 2019. So here's another question. Yay, thanks, Mike. The question is, are there accepted approaches or good models of communities that are composed of many competitors, but who still have potential advantages of being in a community?
I mean, I'm going to go off my experience here to enter this one. I kind of alluded to it at the end of my talk that um, I'm in several communities consisting of fellow community professionals, and all of us are trying, you know, perhaps not so much now in the case of my consultancy, but when I was working at Shopify, for example, I was in a community with other e-commerce developer community folks that were trying to, grow their e-commerce developer communities, and so was I. And so in some ways we were competitors, but it never really felt that way, simply because I think the nature of community is such that you're really looking for opportunities to complement each other and scale each other's mission. Like, community to me is more about taking up the essence of what you're trying to do. So for example, I was at Shopify helping to build out their developer community experience, but ultimately what kept me motivated was to kind of make the e-commerce developer community a better place, right? And so that benefits everyone, including Shopify. It benefits all developers that are working on e-commerce types of projects. So if you identify sort of like a community that has, I'm not sure if this is addressing your question exactly, but if you're sort of identifying a community that has multiple competitors, there's actually ways that, as opposed to sort of seeing it as competition, you can kind of see it as complementary efforts and opportunities to work together to kind of move a particular shared vision forward. And I know that's a little, woo woo, but that's what keeps me getting out of bed in the morning, right? I
Yeah,
hope that was
I
helpful.
yeah, Mike says thank you. So
Okay, great.
another question I just occurred to me because that made me think of a community that I'm a part of that is technically competitors. They're all looking for clients in the same world area. They're not. It's not a tech community, but it's um, uh, so I was just thinking about the difference between that community, which has a website where people can have like a profile and talk about the work that they do, much in the way that, say, Facebook or LinkedIn would allow you to have some information about yourself, versus other kinds of community tools that you've alluded to, like Google Groups, for example, or other, or Stack Exchange, where you can have just you just sign it up, and yes, people will see who you are through your icon and you know a username or whatever, but there's not necessarily you as a presence and about you that they can find out not much anyway. I mean, some of these communities will put like parenting communities where they'll say daughter age 8 and son age 3 or something like that, or doing X job for X number of years or whatever, whatever little tagline is about their qualifications. But I'm wondering if you see benefits, particularly among people who are more technical, for having something where your identity is out there versus where your identity is a little bit, less. I mean, where you have a page about you versus a not a page
Yeah,
about you.
yeah. So again, this is my response is definitely going to be informed by what I've seen happening in different developer communities and maybe my own personal experience a little bit. But communities like, certainly in the developer world, communities like, mentioned Stack Exchange. In the case of developers, it would be Stack Overflow. And there's other places like a community called Hacker News. These are communities where your identity is a lot less obvious. You're using pseudonyms. There may be, like you said, a very small page that just indicates, your username and some basic bio. But often these sites are also driven by something called karma points. So the more you're answering questions and more people upvote you, the more karma points you have. So you're building out sort of expertise in that way. The problem with some of these communities is without that accountability of like showing who you really are. Sometimes there's, code of conduct infractions a lot more frequently than there would be somewhere where it's much more associated with your actual identity as a professional. And so I tend to discourage developer communities from putting all of their eggs in these more anonymous baskets. I think that they serve a purpose because there's a lot of developers participating in these communities and using them for resources, and so they can't be overlooked, but I think they should be weaved into a community strategy in a way that there are opportunities for the community to remain accountable and remain professional and welcoming. And so there's another community that I love. It's called, I didn't include it in this just because it's very, very developer focused, but it's called dev.to, so dev.to. They're fairly new, but they've been growing like crazy. And it's a place where everyone has an individual profile and is able to contribute a lot of articles and content. And they've really set the stage from an early stage. About the importance of their code of conduct and moderation, and it's really just resulted in this really lovely, so far, knock on wood, I'm a moderator there and everything looks great, but so far it's just a really friendly, welcoming, great place to learn new technologies, make connections, and grow your developer community or your developer connections. And so, in my opinion, accountability is key, keeps people kind of honest. But
So that
other
one,
people,
you're saying they do have their identities out there,
yeah,
in terms of,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's really helpful to know. I mean, it's a really good point that being a hidden does make it a lot more vulnerable to not following a code of conduct.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's great. No other questions have popped up, and I see we're almost at the top of the hour. So I'm going to thank you so much again, Sarah Jane. That was just so helpful for us. I've certainly at SGCI, but other folks have put in comments along the way saying thank you.